So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ingrid Willard. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and I'm here to wish you, to welcome you very warmly on behalf of the faculty and on behalf of Professor Burger. You're all very welcome, but I have some special welcomes to do. Our Rector and Vice Chancellor, Professor Wim de Villiers, is here, together with his wife, Catherine. We have a special guest, the Vice Chancellor of Coventry University, Professor John Latham, who is visiting us this week, and we wanted to show off a little bit, so we've invited him to Ronelle's lecture. No pressure, Ronelle. Ronelle's husband, Tina Boyson, is here, together with their daughters, Hannah and Cara. Ronelle's brothers, Rudolf and Kobus, who are both brothers and colleagues, are with us this evening. A warm welcome to you. Ronelle's in-laws, Noreen and Tina Boyson, and her parents, Lydia and Connie Burger. Also, a warm welcome to those of you that have braved the traffic from Cape Town. It's impressive that you made it here for 5:30 start. Thank you so much for being here for Ronelle. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Burger. She was promoted to the rank of full professor in the Department of Economics in 2017. She holds a BA from Stellenbosch University, an honours degree in journalism, which explains why she writes so beautifully, also from Stellenbosch University, followed by an honours degree in economics from the University of Cape Town, an MPhil in economics from Cambridge, and finally a PhD in economics from the University of Nottingham, which she completed in 2009. Professor Burger is a key member of RECEP, Research on Socio-Economic Policy in the Department of Economics, where she leads the work in the area of health. She and her team have earned an enviable and laudable reputation for credible and relevant research. This year alone, they have published 10 papers in high-impact and high-ranking field journals, such as the Journal of Hypertension, +1, Social Science and Medicine, and Water Research. They've presented their work at Oxford, Nottingham, Erasmus University in Rotterdam, Ghent University, Imperial College London, and the International Health Economics Association Conference. Perhaps even more important is the increasing number of citations of their work in journals such as Lancet Global Health and the British Medical Journal Global Health, signaling that their work is perceived as credible and impactful. In the last year or so, Professor Burger has shared a podium with the previous Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, has been invited to write a comment for Lancet Global Health, has been appointed to the editorial board of the highly prestigious Journal of Development Studies, and most recently has been appointed to the Ministerial Task Team for Human Resource Planning at the National Department of Health. Professor Burger is also a research fellow at the Partnership for Economic Policy and the Centre for Research in Economic Development and International Trade at Nottingham University. She has consulted to national and provincial government and also multilateral donors such as UNICEF and the World Bank. Her work has been published in many high-impact development and health field journals, such as Lancet Global Health, Economic Development and Cultural Change, and World Development. A key focus of Ronelle's research is an examination of why vulnerable communities receive such poor public services. And so it's my delight to invite you to listen to her this evening speak on the topic of amplifying the voices of our communities. Congratulations, Ronelle.
I chose today to speak to you on this topic because it's something that's very close to my heart and also really at the core of the research that I've been conducting over the past decade with my team. I care about amplifying the voices of communities because I believe it's an important way that we can make our society more equitable and just. Those of you that know a little bit about how I spend my days know that my team and I earn our living by listening to the stories of community members about unwanted pregnancies, leaking roofs, unavailable TB medicine, rude nurses, and severely ill children. In the last 10 years, we've been involved in a variety of projects in many different settings and fields, but they've all been attempts to listen closely and listen anew to stories, whether it be through primary data gathering or through secondary data analysis. These stories that we hear are often not the stories we want to hear. In fact, they're not the stories we hope to encounter, but they're always stories that touch us and change us. As an economic researcher, we also often use analytical and econometric skills to summarize these experiences in bar graphs and cross-tabulations and regressions. Based on our aggregation and analysis of these stories, we make recommendations to policymakers about what should be done to make things better. This is the way we carry the stories to the people who need to hear them. Over the past few years, we've told devastating stories about how the high level of trauma and death affects mental health and well-being of South African households. We've told stories about the sacrifices made by caregivers of young children with MDR-TB. We've told stories about domestic workers, which shows their close relationships with their employers benefit their children primarily and their household members more than themselves. We've told heartbreaking stories about South Africa's failing education system, where at the age of 8, most children's fate has been sealed because they're already so far behind that there are minimal chances of entering into a secure and well-paying professional job. We have also recently told hard-hitting stories about nurses not following protocols, nurses not giving community members the care that they need and deserve. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into this last story. First, I want to give you a bit of background. This set of stories. This set of stories has been particularly hard won. In 2016, our team embarked upon a standardized patient or mystery patient study to assess the quality of clinical services, public primary health facilities in Cape Town and East London Metro. This was the early days of our health economics team. So we had only a shoestring budget, and I need to mention Anya, Carmen, and Carl by name because they were really the heart and soul of this operation. First, I need to explain why we chose standardized or mystery patient, because it's far more expensive and far more cumbersome than alternatives. We chose this method because no other method can produce data that's so granular, so personal, and so honest. Direct observations of how nurses interact with patients come closest, but they're affected by the Hawthorne effect and also placebo effects. Also, because this is a third-party account essentially, it lacks some of the personal and granular aspects that we get through standardized patient approach. Additionally, patient file audits are not so useful in South Africa because nurses tend to take limited notes because of time pressure, and note-taking is worse in the poorest and most vulnerable communities, which we really care about the most and where we're most concerned about. I also need to explain a little bit. Some of you might be familiar with the standardized patient approach, and some of you might not be familiar with it. A standardized patient or mystery patient approach is similar in most respects to a mystery shopper approach. It's essentially somebody who's pretending to be an average shopper or average patient, but who's in fact assessing the quality of the service that is being provided. In the case of primary healthcare, it's very important to select very standardized services where a certain opening sentence will very predictably map to a set of prompts, a set of tests, and then ultimately a diagnosis, so that we can very clearly assess whether protocols were followed and have a very clear and predictable and simple map of what should follow the opening sentence. For our study, therefore, we decided to focus on hypertension screening, contraception advice, and TB screening. The way the approach works is that a standardized patient presents to the health worker with a specific opening sentence such as, I've been coughing a lot recently, or I need advice on contraception. And this then leads into a set of prompts and a set of further questions by the nurse according to the national guidelines and also good clinical practice. After the visit, the standardized patient then captures the experience of the visit in a very standardized format that we call the score sheet. Our standardized patients were recruited from local communities, and they received extensive training to ensure that they know how to answer the nurse questions, but also to ensure that they don't disclose additional information that would violate the integrity of what we're doing. This is the first time that a standardized patient study has been conducted in South Africa on this scale. So it was pioneering work. It was tough, but worthwhile. Across all clinical domains, we found that service delivery was lacking, that nurses were not complying with protocols, and that clinics were missing opportunities. What is useful about this also is that the methodology allows us to be incredibly specific. We're not just saying that we're not getting as many patients or patients are not entering early. We can actually say the patient was not told to come back after their TB test. And that, I think, is a very helpful information to give to both policy makers and policy implementers. I'll talk you through some of the slides now, but the more exciting part of this. I'll briefly look at all three clinical areas, TB, contraception, and then also hypertension. So what you see here, this is a few core results from the standardized patient work with TB screening. Basically, the patient opened with a statement that they've been coughing a lot recently, and then upon prompting, they would say they have been coughing for more than 2 weeks, which according to the national guidelines should immediately steer the patient into TB screening mode, especially given our high prevalence of TB. We have one of the highest TB burdens globally and the highest TB incidence in the world. The first thing that we see from the graphs is that gathering of evidence on symptoms is far from perfect. But I think far more concerning than the red bars are the gray bars. Firstly, we find that, especially in the Eastern Cape metros, there were a lot of unnecessary antibiotics that were prescribed. We find that there are instances where, even though it's a very clear prompt to do TB screening, patients are not receiving a TB test. But perhaps the two bar graphs that are most concerning from this work is the fact that only half of the patients were tested for HIV, offered an HIV test. This is concerning for at least two reasons. The first is that given our focus on 90-90-90 targets, this is a very easy opportunity that we're missing, and we shouldn't be missing it. It's a low-cost opportunity to screen for HIV. But the second part is as concerning, and that is that the TB testing algorithm is dependent on knowing the HIV status of the patient and is likely to give false negatives if the HIV status of the patient is not confirmed. Then the second part that's really of concern for me is that less than a third of the patients are reminded to come back to collect their test results. And this is a concern because nationally we know that 1 in 5 patients who get TB tests never return to collect their test results. And this is a very easy way in which we can improve TB screening and TB detection and ensure that TB patients get to the clinic and get on treatment early. Then similar story with contraception advice. There the patient entered wanting to get advice on contraception. Again, I should stress the importance of this domain, the category that we chose. South Africa has a very, very high level of unwanted pregnancies. And the investment case work has shown that this is really a priority in terms of our health system. We need to pay attention to reducing unwanted pregnancies. But despite the fact that this is such a high priority and that levels are so high, we're definitely also missing opportunities here. The context that I should give is that with contraception, adherence is, of course, incredibly important, and adherence is very much dependent on your lifestyle. So it's important for the nurse, when they are in a contraception consultation, to ask questions about your lifestyle, how easy you find it to come to the clinic monthly, how good are you at pill taking, all of those things, to understand sort of which would be the best contraceptive option for them. And what we find is this is not happening. These bar graphs are particularly disappointing. When we look at patient history and situation, we find that in less than a third of the cases did they capture the medical history and the life circumstances. Medical history is also important because some of the contraceptive options should not be recommended based on the patient's medical history. So it's very important for clinical reasons to capture that. Then what we also find national guidelines require that a pregnancy test should be done, but often, in more than half of cases, there were no pregnancy tests offered to the patients. Then I think what is for me essentially the core is in just over a third of cases that the nurses explain the full range of options available to the women. There's a lot of pressure for women to continue with the injectables, and as a second option, perhaps the pill. There's not enough emphasis on giving them the full range of choices that should be available to them, and that our country really needs to start pushing to ensure that we reduce unwanted pregnancies. And then less than a half of cases were the advantages and disadvantages of options outlined at all. Again, with HIV, we must understand that women seeking contraceptive advice is a high-risk group for HIV. They're women who are sexually active. Still we find, and this really made the National Department of Health incredibly despondent, in less than a fourth of the cases are HIV tests offered to these women. And in just more than a third of cases do they advise dual protection emphatically to the women. All of these, I feel, is missed opportunities in a country where the health system is really struggling. Hypertension, this is the part that I worked on most. Again, hypertension is important for our country because at the moment, hypertension and cardiac-related deaths have overtaken HIV. So it's very important that we invest more in that stream of chronic care to ensure that we do things better. And we can see here a lot of evidence of, again, inferior attentiveness, lack of protocol following, simple things like lifestyle advice. All of these patients, I must first say, all of these patients have on record tested in the hypertensive stage 1 zone, which means that in terms of the national guidelines, they should be receiving lifestyle advice on all of these 6 dimensions. Yet we find that, as a rule, they don't. And one would think that that's a very simple, predictable thing to do. Then, in terms of other common sense, easy wins, like stressing the importance of irregular blood pressure testing for somebody who has just tested in the stage 1 zone, less than half of cases we don't do that. The risks of high blood pressure are also frequently not stressed, and that's a real problem because hypertension is very prevalent in our country, but that often leads to a type of a lack of concern about it because everybody around you have hypertension. So it's incredibly important that the nurses stress the dangers of neglected hypertension to their patients. Perhaps of all the bar graphs on this hypertension sheet, the most upsetting is the failed visit. So we categorized the visit as a failed visit if either the patient was if the patient was both misdiagnosed and also there was no follow-up visit scheduled. So, I mean, this is a very high proportion of cases where we're just missing the boat entirely. Somebody comes all the way to the clinic, they have a consultation, and we don't put them in the right box. We're not providing the care that they need or the advice that they need to live healthy lives. Sorry. With this work also, we encountered some shocking stories. And I just want to, because this is really about diagnosis, I also want to mention a few of them. Because this is really about the stories, I wanted to mention a few of them. This includes things like 90 people waiting for one health worker. Of course, these are qualitative evidence, so, you know, we're not sure how prevalent it is, different from the work that we present here. We can't do bar graphs. But individuals with very serious conditions being shown away from clinics because the nurses have a meeting at 2 o'clock. A patient testing very high and clearly as a stage 1 hypertension case, being given the hypertension test results on a piece of paper, but not giving a consultation because the nurse is too busy. I think all of these things break breaks our hearts. And it's quite tough to sometimes to do this research. We've also, however, luckily, told some good news stories about how ARVs have improved the quality of life of HIV patients and increased the likelihood of survival. We've shared the rapid rise of South Africa's black middle class. We've recently also been telling stories about hope, showing how subsidized housing improves the lives of residents in Ruidake, just outside Grabouw. And I will tell a little bit more about this work just briefly. This is part of a much larger initiative where we really try and engage with understanding subsidized housing and understanding how subsidized housing can be improved, very closely aligned with the Department of Human Settlements. This is an important area of work for us because South Africa has the largest and longest running subsidized housing program in the world with more than 4 billion beneficiaries since 1994. While we acknowledge that there are serious problems with the program, I think we should also acknowledge the power of this program to change lives, because the housing subsidy represented transfer valued at more than 150,000 rands, and thus it's worth about 30 to 60 salary checks for the individual who's receiving this transfer. When we started our work on this project, the first step was to understand how to assess outcomes, and thus we launched a pilot project in Ruidake, just outside Grabouw. The aim of the project was to examine how value was created in subsidized housing projects, considering both technical quality and then also considering from beneficiary welfare perspective how they think about value, the recipient of the house. Because of limited time, I will not talk about the technical quality and only concentrate on the beneficiary welfare assessments. And it was quite interesting and moving for us once again to see to what a large extent the beneficiaries that we spoke to had really appreciate receiving a house, both in terms of the qualitative evidence and then also in terms of these bar graphs. And it's interesting to see which dimension the results were most uniform, and that's in terms of self-worth. 85% of the housing subsidy recipients said that receiving a house has increased their sense of self-worth, which I think is very moving. And I think it increases our sense of the importance of working in this field. Other dimensions that were also mentioned quite often is access to transport, cost of living, safety, noise levels. And this was also shown in some of the qualitative quotes that we got. This includes, "I'm glad because it has changed my life and my child's life," by a 49-year-old female. "My life has improved because I no longer fear a fire that can start any day of the night," by a 35-year-old female. "I'm very satisfied because I used to move frequently and wander a lot," by a 58-year-old female. That sense of permanency and having a home. "It's very different from where I was living. I have my own toilet and rubbish is removed and I'm safe from the wind." This set is a little bit more of a big mixed bag. Firstly, there's a very positive quote. "I'm so happy because I was living in a shack with no water, electricity and toilets, and now I have everything," a 44-year-old male. But then also two more mixed reviews. "I'm satisfied that I got it, but I have this fear that I'm not sure what will happen in the future as it has scary cracks and leaking almost everywhere," by a 40-year-old male. And then the 43-year-old male said, "I'm happy with the house, but not happy with the condition that it's in." I think I like the last two quotes best because it shows the complexity and depth of both being incredibly grateful for something that you've received, but also being aware of the limitations and the future problems that it might cause. I think these two detours on specific studies have been useful to illustrate the type of work that we do. But I now want us to return to the main script about writing stories to amplify the voices of communities. In preparation for this inaugural, I've been reading about the role of stories in various disciplines. There are differences in terminology and where the focus falls, but also many shared themes. Logically, story making involves three distinct processes. Firstly, there's the lived experience that provides the raw material. Then, secondly, there is the first-person account of your personal story. But then there's also a third process involving a public and a social story. This is where we enter. Often it's a select group of third-party retailers, including researchers, journalists, and all kinds of public persona. Today I will focus mostly on the second and the third process. Psychologists recognize the healing power of first-person storytelling. It's an interesting and complicated process where the storyteller steps back from their story to become the teller. When we tell stories about our own lives, we have to make sense of our own story by selecting what to include, ordering these events, and interpreting them. But the power of this narrative is also telling that story to someone and sharing that story and how that story connects to the teller and the listener. Listening is a caring activity where you open ourselves to somebody else in recognition of our interdependence and our accountability to one another. There's an emotional and intellectual benefit to listening. We learn from stories and we connect to them. We are touched and transformed by these personal stories. But it's important to emphasize that this is a two-way street because an attentive and interested listener can yield important benefits to the storyteller too. The Hawthorne effect and the impact of placebos demonstrate that knowing that somebody cares enough to listen to your story can make a difference. But additionally, through interaction and listening, there may also be scope for learning. The health policy researcher and journalist Atul Gawande explains that diagnosis is an iterative and interactive process. He argues that he thinks it's unlikely that robots will soon replace doctors because patients rarely arrive at the doctor with a full list of relevant symptoms. It takes a long list of questions and repeated interactions and probes before a skilled and experienced doctor will be satisfied that all of the important information has been shared. This serves to illustrate that often a fuller story enigmatically emerges in the shared space between a teller and a listener. Where the listeners are researchers or journalists, then the listening occurs for the purpose of retelling the stories into a public and a social space, feeding into specific dialogues and debates. It becomes part of the discussion of the society we live in and the society that we want to be. There are two contradictory Malawian idioms that illustrate this tension in the power and the potential of public and social writing. The one says that strangers cut with a sharper blade, acknowledging that outsiders can contribute fresh insights. The other says that the lion's story will never be told as long as the hunter is the one telling the story, acknowledging the danger of bias and distortion in the retelling of stories. As these idioms illustrate, it's an important responsibility to be entrusted with people's stories, to carry them with us. We have the potential to generate new insights, but also face the risk that we may distort, misinterpret, and misrepresent their stories. The ethical dimensions of retelling stories publicly are more complicated than intuition would suggest. Intuitively, we may be tempted to assume that the first-person narrative is true and authentic, but unfortunately, it's not as simple. There's considerable evidence of false memory and misrepresentation in how we tell our own stories. We often deceive ourselves and others in how we tell our own story because we have stakes in distorting the story of our own life. However, we also misrepresent our stories unintentionally because we have blind spots and can see only part of the picture. Our research has shown examples of such blind spots and how an outsider can bring important insights. Through careful and incremental work, we've started to understand just how large the divide is between doctors and their patients, but also the extent to which information from patients may not always be an accurate reflection of their own experiences. There are a couple of reasons for this, including that patients from poor communities often have very low expectations. In fact, many of the users of public clinics know nothing else than their home clinic. We find that patients are very unlikely to report dissatisfaction, even if they waited long and nurses were rude to them. And they also tend to underreport problems with case management and quality. I previously described our standardized patient work where we train community members to understand what services the national guidelines prescribed and then sent them into the clinics as so-called fake patients. We asked them to assess how well they were treated and how satisfied they were with the care that they received in the clinics, compared to regular patients who visited East London and Cape Town clinics for the same symptoms and the same health needs. In our analytical work, comparing these two groups, the real patients who were at the clinic due to their own accord and our standardized patients, we controlled for important differences in socioeconomic status, education levels, age, and gender. We found that the standardized patients tend to be more critical, but also that their satisfaction was more consistently related to case management quality. Basically, that their satisfaction had a bigger signal-to-noise ratio. There was more signal in it. It reflected better the quality of care that they were receiving. And we ascribe this, it's just a hypothesis, we ascribe it to the training that they received on the protocols and the increased awareness. And of course, this is important for us because if we want to hold service providers to account, it's important to understand these weaknesses and blind spots that may influence how patients are at the moment assessing the services that they're receiving. Just want to show you this graph. So this needs some explaining. You'll see that there are 3 different sets of graphs. These are all comparing the experiences of the real patients and the standardized patients. And they're all for contraception advice. Each of these sets of graphs, bar graphs, look at a specific regression where we examine the relationship between the satisfaction score that was assigned to the visit and the specific experiences that they had in the clinic. So the first one, we looked at how satisfaction was influenced by whether or not the nurse asked about their life circumstances. You know, they're coming for a contraception visit. Did the nurse ask you about the hours you work, the life you lead, or did they not? Then the second set is about talking through a range of options. Here the cut-off was that 3 or more options should be discussed. And then the last set is about explaining the advantages and disadvantages of each of these options. And what we see consistently with this set of regressions is that the standardized patients had the highest coefficient. So the quality indicator affected their satisfaction score more than it did for the real patients. So again, confirming that the standardized patients are more discerning than the real patient. This was also borne out in terms of significance. The standardized patient, all 3 of these coefficients were significant at the 1% level for the standardized patients, and the coefficients for the real patients were not significant even at the 5% level. Additionally, this work also feeds into this. Our work also shows that technical language can impede research and service delivery. This is work that is part of Martina's PhD thesis, and what she's done is there's a demographic and health survey where they've done facility visits at 412 facilities in Malawi in 2016, 2014, okay. And this is remarkably interesting facility visits because they had a medical specialist doing a direct observation of the antenatal care visit for an entire day at each of these 412 facilities. And then they had a team of people interviewing the same women as they left the facility, asking them exit interview questions, which is, I mean, that's the workhorse for health researchers. And what's remarkable is that our workhorse did not do so well. And that it seems to be very related to the clarity of the questions that they asked. So something was very clear, like, did you get iron tablets or did you not get iron tablets? These are all pregnant women coming for their antenatal care visit. Did you get iron tablets or did you not? So a very high degree of correspondence. This is correspondence between those that did get what share of them confirmed that they did get this in the exit interviews. So we treat the direct observation as the true north. Again, something specific, they did make the language, I tried to use the exact language that they used in the question. So they asked, did you get pills to prevent you getting malaria? So they didn't use malaria prophylaxis or any kind of fancy medical word. And again, we have a pretty good correspondence. But then, even when we ask questions about whether or not you got advice on nutrition, we already see that the correspondence falls to about 80%. But I think it looks like pregnancy complications and side effects are really red herrings, because there the correspondence is really not acceptable. I mean, we can't trust their data. So around 60% for advice on pregnancy complications, and at 30% for advice on the side effects from iron tablets. And I think that's really concerning. We need to understand this better. But given that this is really the workhorse of a lot of what we think we know about the health system, it will be devastating if this interpretation is shown to be correct and valid. More anecdotally, the value of a third-party observer was recently illustrated during clinical consultation observations for HIV intervention scoping study in Guinea for Doctors Without Borders. A doctor was agitated and emphatic about a female HIV patient needing to keep her appointments, repeatedly pointing at the schedule of appointments when the research assistant asked the doctor whether he checked that the woman was able to read. It turned out that she was not literate and ashamed to admit that she could not read her schedule of appointments, and this is why she failed to show up for appointments. We have done similar work in the NGO sector in Uganda to try and understand these gaps in understanding, gaps in information transfer, and to show how strong sectoral norms around transparency and community participation can lead to misrepresentation and superficial compliance. So I think it feeds into the same theme of understanding the divide and understanding to what extent a third-party observer can add value by showing where things are lost and how communication fails to happen and work well. So what we did in the NGO sector in Uganda is in separate sessions, we asked NGOs, a group of 300 representative NGOs, and the communities that they work in, very careful, long list of questions about how the community and the NGO interacted, very specific and very kind of empirical. And what we were shocked to discover is that we picked up very dramatic discrepancies in how they described their relationship and how they described the extent to which the community was involved in the NGO projects. These discrepancies are summarized in these graphs. The first graph is for community need assessments and the second one for community feedback. So these are two, again, workhorses of all NGO projects. Community needs assessment needs to happen prior to a project. You need to ascertain whether the project that you're launching is really something that's needed by the community. And then secondly, after you complete a project, donors require that you need to get feedback from the community to find out what went well and whether they appreciated what has happened, and then you write this up in a report. What is disappointing, but I guess not entirely surprising, is that we find very large discrepancies between what the NGO says they did and what the community said the NGO did. And we think our interpretation of what's happening is correct because it's very asymmetric. There are very few cases where the community said that the NGO involved them in their work and the NGO said that they didn't. And also there's a remarkable degree of overlap. So basically in 4 out of 10 cases, the NGO claims that they involve the community in their work, and when we go to the communities and we ask them about how things work, they said that this did not happen. Which I think on the surface is an interesting result, but I think if you think more deeply about this, and if you reflect on the extent to which the NGO sector and a lot of other funding is reliant on self-reported information, this is an irresponsible use of public money if we do not have direct feedback from the community incorporated in our understanding of whether funding was well allocated or not. And I think given the very strong norms about community participation in the NGO sector and the pressure that NGOs are under, one has a kind of understanding for the fact that some of this window dressing will happen, but for social reasons and for, due to the fact that this is public funding, I think it's very important to not forgive it and to think of better ways in assessing these projects and ensuring that there is accountability for the money. That graph leads into this graph, which was a work that followed on from the first survey's analysis. Being worried about what's happening in the NGO sector and whether the good guys are winning the fight, we went back to Uganda to interview and look for the NGOs that were surveyed in 2002. So we went back in 2008, so 6 years later, to see who survived and who did not survive. And additional information that I should give is that because we interviewed all of the communities, we also asked them additional questions. And one of the most interesting additional questions that was devised by Abigail Barr from Oxford is that she created a value-added measure where she presented the community at the focus group, community members at the focus group, with a pile of 100 beans, and then asked them to imagine a scenario where the NGO that they're assessing is facing bankruptcy and will need to close their doors, and they need to decide what share of the beans they want to give towards saving the NGO and what share of it they want to use in different ways. And they could also just divide it between themselves or use it for a community hall. And the interesting thing for us was to correlate that measure, the different measures of how the community saw the value that the NGO was created with the probability of them surviving. And this bar graph summarizes the lack of relationship that we found, which is also what we found in our regressions. We found other things that have an interesting relationship, like whether or not you received a grant, how old you are, whether you had good networks overseas. All of those things made a difference to your likelihood of survival, but adding value to the community did not. I think that is really concerning for us. This matters because it means that the NGOs that are most responsive to community needs are not the ones that are getting the funding. The ones that are doing the best work in the eyes of the community are not the ones that are getting the funding. Conversely, and perhaps even more concerning, it means that the bad NGOs are not being weeded out systematically. The ones that are adding value and not adding value and not doing what they should be will continue often to exist and receive grant funding. And largely, this draws back to the first slide about the reliance of donors on self-reported information, which is a big part of the problem. All of these cases have illustrated that outsiders do sometimes come with sharper knives, but that there are also, of course, countless examples of third parties badly distorting stories in their retelling, and I'm sure we've been guilty of that as well. So I also want to spend some time on this. There appear to be two useful but imperfect mechanisms in place to avoid such bias and distortion. First, it helps to know that there are some inherent incentives in place to encourage honest effort and critical introspection. Story makers are bridge builders, and thus they need to be trusted as both safekeepers of stories and as credible messengers by the public reading their stories. This means that there are inherent incentives for integrity, credibility, reliability, and thus to self-police their claims about how they represent stories. Secondly, in an open and free society, there should be a pluralism of potential subjective narratives, and these conflicts and debates between such subjective perspectives will create an intersubjectivity, a type of middle ground that will balance out and interrogate extreme versions of the narrative. In practice, we fall short on both counts. Firstly, we fall short on holding story makers to account because we lack critical and attentive engagement. We are all prone to mold our world perspectives to suit ourselves. We have recently been reminded of this by Trump's allegations of fake news, by anti-vaxxers' strong belief in their anti-scientific conspiracies, by uncomfortable truths only affecting public opinion when they're conveniently summarized in an entertaining and compelling documentary form, and also with compelling recent research evidence about the lengths that people go to avoid bad news and information that will complicate their lives. Essentially, we are all ostriches. We also fall short on the second count, because in the ideal world, there would be a broader and more inclusive participation in open forums on social media or mobile surveys. And there should be as much diversity among story makers as among storytellers. Sadly, though, this is not the case. Social media has been captured by corporates with algorithms that select the content that would mirror our own views and strengthen our own biases and prejudices. Politicians are not helping to create such platforms either. The biggest and most persistent discouragement throughout my career has been the inattentiveness of politicians and policymakers in South Africa. We know and understand that the lack of responsiveness is the rule rather than the exception, and can be attributed to weaknesses of political institutions and mechanisms for accountability. Political accountability, and thus also credibility, are global problems, but in South Africa, the problem is severe due to the design of the electoral system, but also information and accountability issues in service delivery chains. Understanding it doesn't help much. It still breaks my heart because it's such a gigantic waste of resources. Then, despite all the virtues of the South African stubborn and brave free press, they're also not serving as an accessible platform for a dialogue between South Africans rich and poor. Ambitious shouters and savvy attention seekers tend to dominate the media, but may often not represent the thoughts and opinions of our people. I worry about the low number of media users and the segmentation of separate media products according to demography, because this means we are not listening and talking to people. This means that we're listening and talking to people who already share our point of view. We are choosing to live in echo chambers by not broadening our own horizons via radio shows we listen to and the newspapers we read. Then there are NGOs. Many grassroots NGOs are doing their best to highlight the plight of the communities, but they're facing considerable pressure, have little support, and are fighting to survive financially. They're part of the solution, but they are seldom strong enough to drive the change that they envision. These weaknesses in the system matter, because there's a fourth stage or reflexive stage where social and public story making and writing influence the stories we are and the stories we live into. Recently, I started wondering about the promises we make on the consent forms we provide to research participants. In these consent forms, we list as a benefit of participation the prospect of this research being a driver of change. In reality, we often fail to deliver this change. We tell our stories for a specific purpose. We want to cast a light on the plight of poor service delivery in vulnerable and marginalized communities with our stories and urge the government to pay more attention. We want to change and influence society to ensure that communities and citizens are at the center of the government's agenda, not at the periphery. We need to get our messages and stories to government, but also to its citizens and grassroots NGOs that can help put pressure on the government. These stories we tell about our society can influence the society we become. I, however, worry because I think often the stories do not influence people. As an economist, I think there's a supply side and a demand side aspect to it. I will acknowledge that I think we could do better. Our bar graphs and our stories do not travel far enough. Policymakers are often too busy workshopping and appear to largely regard research as irrelevant to the decisions that they make, preferring to base their policy making on a combination of precedent, whim, and opinion. Many of us do not know how to get our stories to the citizens and communities that need them. We gear our writing towards international development and policy journals, but the template for international journals requires substantial abstraction so that the stories can be understood by the international audience. And thus, our stories are diluted and sanitized to fit the analytical mold of the aggregate. Simply put, we don't spend enough of our time thinking about how to tell these stories well and how to reach a broader audience where our stories can affect our society and not just impress our academic peers. However, on the other hand, I also recognize that this is partly a social problem. If we can't improve the public's ability to absorb and make sense of divergent and complicated stories, there will be little scope for broad-based informed debate to shape our society's priorities. And this is a depressing prospect for anyone who believes in bottom-up change, downward accountability, and responsive governments. The problem is partly information overload, but the answer cannot be that we get our stories to people with aggressive targeting and attractive packaging, spoon-feeding them palatable stories that they expect and want to hear. Narrowly targeted and manipulative infotainment campaigns are likely to entrench and worsen social polarization. Perhaps big data and social media can be part of the answer if the incentive structure, governance, and regulation allow it to be more open and democratic and prevent abuses and rampant power grabs. I think fair access to such a platform to share thoughts and ideas is crucial for democracy to flourish, crucial for encouraging greater community responsiveness amongst public officials, vital to collectively debate how we are doing and to help us figure out how we can do better. Joseph Stiglett's work has convincingly demonstrated that there's a role for government and public watchdogs in this space, and arguably more so in the days of Google and Facebook than in previous eras. We need to legislate both transparency and the protection of privacy and use a diverse set of public and non-profit funding institutions to promote broader social dialogue, in-depth scrutiny, public scrutiny, and the promotion and teaching of critical engagement skills at schools. In trying to close the gaps on both supply and demand side, perhaps the best place is to start closest to home, examining whether our own work is responsive to the daily battles of the people of South Africa. We cannot expect our stories to travel far if they do not resonate with what matters in the lives of community members. We cannot expect our stories to travel far if they're not told in the language and the words of our community members speak to one another. It's vital that the stories that our researchers write and tell must also mirror the worries and concerns of the people of South Africa. It needs to feed into their daily lives and connect with what they care about. I acknowledge that university researchers also have an agenda-setting role. So as a footnote here, I will add that I understand that our research should not always be responsive to community needs. However, I think that our research should endeavor to often or mostly be responsive to community needs, because this is the best way to achieve the alignment that would enable us to build partnerships to mobilize and fight for the greater public sector responsiveness and better channels for downward accountability. I must mention here that this is, of course, my research realm. This is not broadly for all research at the university. Throughout this lecture, I've been very vocal about the challenges of this work. So it's important that I also acknowledge that I feel enormously grateful to do this work. I'm thankful to have a job that I find meaningful and worthwhile. And I'm grateful that I can spend my days with students, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers who are passionate about asking interesting and courageous questions and listening carefully to the answers. I'm indebted to my mentors who guide my work and to my dear family and friends who love and support me daily. In particular, I also want to thank my daughters, Hannah and Cara, for making me care so deeply about the future. And for my best friend, Tinas, whose heart I love and trust, because I know injustice is unbearable to him. I must, however, end today by thanking in particular the people who have opened their doors, answered their phones, and showed up at our focus groups to tell their stories to us. Looking back and stepping back, I'm very aware of the ways in which our research is falling short, but at the same time, I'm encouraged and strengthened to know that we're moving forward as long as we continue to show up and listen to each other's stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronelle. You have, with great courage, compassion, and dedication, demonstrated exactly what it is that the university means when they talk about embedded research with social impact. May that message carry far and wide. It is my honor and my big pleasure to welcome you as full professor to the Department of Economics, to thank you for your valuable contribution, and to wish you great success and enjoyment in the continuation of your career with us. On behalf of Ronelle, I also have thank yous to say. I've translated from the Afrikaans, so forgive me if the emphasis is not exactly in the right places. She would like to thank, in the first place, her mentors, her PhD students, all brave souls. In Afrikaans, she said, hulle is almal dapper helde. The university support staff, especially the Department for Research and Development, the Ethics Committee, Karine, Karina, Ina, and for tonight's function, Ronelle Burger. A very special thank you to her family, her brothers, daughters, husband, parents and parents-in-law, as well as colleagues and friends that showed up to celebrate this exciting milestone with her. And on that note, I thank you very much for attending and invite you to come and join us in the celebrations.